Sometimes life breaks you so completely that you forget what hope even looks like. Jake Mercer knew that feeling buried his wife, lost his business, and watched his dreams crumble like old paper. When a lawyer called about inheriting his grandfather's house, Jake almost said no. He'd never met the old man, but with nowhere else to go, and his daughter needing a roof over her head, he packed up and drove to the middle of nowhere. The Victorian mansion was a disaster. Rotting wood, broken windows, weeds growing through the porch. His old dog Rusty looked as tired as Jake felt. But sometimes broken things hide the most beautiful secrets. What happens when your faithful companion discovers something that changes everything? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The drive to Millbrook had taken 14 hours, counting the stops for Emma to use gas station restrooms and for Rusty to stretch his aging legs. Jake's Honda Civic, the only vehicle he'd managed to keep after the bankruptcy, wheezed up the winding mountain road like an old man climbing stairs. In the back seat, 8-year-old Emma pressed her face to the window, watching pine trees blur past in the fading afternoon light. "Are we almost there, Daddy?" she asked, for the 100th time, her voice carrying that particular tone children use when they're trying to be patient but running out of steam. "Almost, sweetheart." Jake glanced at her in the rearview mirror. Even after everything they'd been through, the hospital visits, the funeral, the slow dissolution of their comfortable life, Emma still had Sarah's eyes. Clear blue, trusting, full of wonder that Jake wasn't sure he deserved anymore. Beside Emma, Rusty lifted his graying muzzle and looked out the window with the resigned expression of a dog who'd learned that life meant constant change. The German Shepherd had been Sarah's idea, back when they thought their biggest worry would be whether to have a second child. Now, at 10 years old, Rusty moved with the careful deliberation of someone who understood that every step might hurt a little more than the last. The GPS announced their arrival with electronic cheerfulness that felt like mockery. Jake turned onto what the device optimistically called Elm Street, really just a gravel path flanked by overgrown hedges and mailboxes that leaned at defeated angles. House numbers appeared sporadically, painted on fence posts or carved into weather-beaten wood. 1247, 1251, 1255. "There," Jake said, more to himself than to Emma. 1259 Elm Street. The Victorian mansion sat back from the road like a grand dame, fallen on hard times. 3 stories of once elegant architecture now sagged under the weight of decades of neglect. The wraparound porch listed to one side, supported by makeshift wooden props that someone had installed years ago and never removed. Paint peeled from the siding in long, curling strips that reminded Jake of old bandages. Ivy had claimed the eastern wall entirely, creating a green shroud that made the windows look like sleepy eyes. "It's big," Emma said with the diplomatic tone she'd developed since Sarah's death, always trying to find something positive to say when the world insisted on being disappointing. "It is that." Jake turned off the engine, and silence settled around them like dust. Through the windshield, the house seemed to be waiting, patient as an old dog. The front gate hung open, its iron hinges protesting with a squeal as Jake pushed it wider. Weeds had pushed through the brick walkway, creating a pathway that nature was slowly reclaiming. A wooden sign near the door read, "Thornfield Manor," in faded gold letters, though Jake had only ever known it as grandfather's house in the few conversations his father had ever bothered to have about family. Theodore Mercer had been a mystery wrapped in silence. Jake's father, Thomas, had mentioned him perhaps a dozen times in Jake's entire childhood, and always with the uncomfortable tone people use when discussing relatives who've chosen to disappear from family gatherings. "Your grandfather lives up north somewhere," Thomas would say, as if geographical distance explained 30 years of absence. keeps to himself, always has. When the lawyer, a tired-sounding man named Harrison Wells, had called 3 weeks ago, Jake had assumed there was some mistake. Mr. Mercer, this is regarding the estate of Theodore James Mercer. You've been named as sole beneficiary. I think you have the wrong person, Jake had said, cradling the phone between his shoulder and ear while he sorted through another stack of overdue bills. I never knew my grandfather. Nevertheless, sir, the will is quite specific. You inherit the property and all contents thereof, provided you take residence within 60 days of notification. 60 days. Jake had looked around the one-bedroom apartment he and Emma were sharing, at the eviction notice taped to the refrigerator, at Emma's homework, spread across a card table because they'd had to sell the dining room set months ago. Sometimes life didn't give you choices, just directions. Now, standing before the massive front door, Jake felt the weight of all the decisions that had led them here. The brass knocker was green with age, shaped like a lion's head, with eyes that seemed to follow movement. Jake had expected the door to be locked, had prepared himself for another small frustration, but the heavy oak panels swung open at his touch with a groan that echoed through the house like a sigh. "Hello?" Jake called into the dimness, more from politeness than any expectation of answer. His voice bounced back from high ceilings, creating an echo that made the house feel vast and empty. Emma slipped her small hand into his as they stepped across the threshold. The entryway opened into what had once been an impressive foyer, complete with a curved staircase that swept upward into shadows. Dust motes danced in the last rays of sunlight, filtering through tall windows, creating an atmosphere that felt suspended between past and present. "It smells like Mrs. Patterson's attic," Emma whispered, referencing their former neighbor who used to let her play dress-up with vintage clothes. She wasn't wrong. The house carried the scent of old wood, dust, and something else, a faint mustiness that spoke of rooms closed too long, of air that hadn't moved freely in years. But underneath those expected smells was something more pleasant, the ghost of pipe tobacco, perhaps, or leather-bound books. Rusty padded past them with the confidence of a dog who'd learned to take new places in stride. His nails clicked on what appeared to be original hardwood floors, though years of neglect had dulled their finish to a tired brown. He disappeared into a room on the left, and Jake heard him settling down with the heavy sigh dogs make when they've decided a place is acceptable. "Should we look around?" Emma asked, her natural curiosity beginning to overcome the strangeness of the situation. "I suppose we should." Jake found a light switch and was surprised when ancient fixtures actually responded, casting warm yellow light across the foyer. "Stay close, though. We don't know how safe this place is." They explored room by room, Jake making mental notes of necessary repairs, while Emma provided a running commentary that shifted between wonder and practical observations that reminded him painfully of Sarah. "This room is really big, but the wallpaper is peeling." That was the dining room, where a massive table sat draped in dust covers like a sleeping giant. "Look, Daddy, there are books everywhere." That was the library, where floor-to-ceiling shelves lined 3 walls, filled with volumes that looked like they hadn't been disturbed in decades. "Why are all the windows so dirty?" That was the sitting room, where heavy curtains blocked most of the natural light, creating an atmosphere of perpetual twilight. The kitchen hadn't been updated since the 1950s, but everything appeared functional. The refrigerator hummed to life when Jake plugged it in, and water flowed from the tap after a few seconds of rusty protest. In the pantry, they found canned goods with expiration dates from just 2 years ago, evidence that Theodore had been living here more recently than anyone had realized. "He was here," Jake said, more to himself than to Emma, holding a can of soup that suggested his grandfather had been a real person with real needs, not just a name on legal documents. "Who was here?" Emma asked. "My grandfather, your great-grandfather, the man who left us this house. Why didn't we ever meet him?" It was a reasonable question that Jake couldn't answer. He'd asked his father the same thing once, years ago, and had received only a shrug and a change of subject. Family dynamics, Jake had learned, could be as complex and mysterious as abandoned houses. As evening settled over Millbrook, Jake and Emma made their temporary camp in the library. The room felt the most welcoming, perhaps because books suggested warmth and stories, or perhaps because Rusty had claimed a spot on the old Persian rug and seemed content. They ate sandwiches from their cooler while sitting on dust-covered furniture, planning their next steps. "We'll need to hire someone to inspect the electrical and plumbing," Jake said, consulting a list he'd started on his phone. "And we should probably have the roof checked. Some of those shingles looked loose." "Are we going to live here?" Emma asked, picking at her sandwich. "For a while, yes. Is that okay?" Emma considered this with the seriousness she brought to all major questions. "It's different, but different isn't always bad, right?" "Right." Jake reached over to squeeze her hand. "Different can be an adventure. Mom used to say that adventures were just problems you hadn't solved yet." The casual reference to Sarah hit Jake in the chest, as these moments always did. Emma had stopped talking about her mother for months after the funeral, and Jake had worried that she was forgetting. But lately, small memories had been surfacing, fragments of Sarah's wisdom, delivered in Emma's matter-of-fact way. "Your mom was smart about a lot of things," Jake said carefully. "I know," Emma yawned, the long day finally catching up with her. "Do you think great-grandfather was smart too? This house is really big. You have to be pretty smart to build something this big, right?" Jake looked around the library, taking in the careful craftsmanship of the built-in shelves, the way the room's proportions created a sense of comfort despite its size. Even in its current state of neglect, the house showed evidence of thoughtful design and quality construction. "I think he might have been," Jake said. "We'll learn more about him as we go." That night, they slept in sleeping bags on the library floor, with Rusty standing guard nearby. The house settled around them with the creaks and sighs of old wood, but the sounds felt protective rather than threatening. Through the tall windows, moonlight painted everything in silver, making the room feel like something from a fairy tale. Jake lay awake long after Emma's breathing had settled into sleep rhythms, thinking about the path that had brought them here. 6 months ago, he'd been a successful architect with a thriving practice, a beautiful wife, and a future that seemed assured. Now he was a widower, sleeping on a stranger's floor, trying to rebuild from ruins he still didn't fully understand. But as he looked at Emma's peaceful face in the moonlight and felt Rusty's warm presence nearby, Jake realized something had shifted. For the first time since Sarah's death, he wasn't just surviving, he was curious. About the house, about Theodore, about what tomorrow might bring. Outside, an owl called to its mate, and somewhere in the walls, the old house whispered its secrets to the night. Morning came with the sound of Emma's laughter echoing through the old house, the first genuine joy Jake had heard from her in months. He found her in the kitchen, attempting to coax Rusty into playing fetch with a tennis ball she'd discovered in one of the dusty corners. "He's being lazy, Daddy," she announced, hands on her hips in perfect imitation of Sarah's determined stance. "Mom always said exercise was important for old dogs." Rusty regarded the ball with the patient expression of a creature who understood that enthusiasm was a young person's game. His tail gave a polite wag, but he remained firmly planted on the kitchen's cracked linoleum. "Maybe he's just getting used to the new place," Jake suggested, accepting the cup of instant coffee Emma had prepared with the gravity of a trained barista. The kitchen windows faced east, filling the room with golden morning light that made even the dated appliances look charming. After breakfast, Jake began his systematic assessment of the house's condition. The architect in him couldn't help but admire the craftsmanship, even as he catalogued necessary repairs. The original builders had used quality materials, solid oak floors, genuine plaster walls, copper pipes that had aged gracefully. But 30 years of minimal maintenance had taken their toll. In the dining room, water stains on the ceiling suggested roof problems. The bathroom on the second floor had a toilet that rocked when you sat on it, indicating issues with the subfloor. Several windows had broken sash cords, leaving them stuck half open like surprised expressions. "This is going to cost more than we have," Jake muttered, making notes on his phone while Emma explored the upper floors with the fearless curiosity of childhood. It was nearly noon when Rusty's behavior changed. Jake was in the library, trying to estimate the cost of having the hardwood floors refinished, when he noticed the German shepherd standing perfectly still near the far wall. Rusty's ears were pricked forward, his head tilted at an angle that suggested intense concentration. "What is it, boy?" Jake asked, looking around the room for whatever had captured the dog's attention. Rusty took 3 deliberate steps toward the built-in bookshelves, then stopped again. His nose twitched, testing the air. After a moment of stillness that felt pregnant with possibility, he began to pace back and forth along a 6-foot section of the wall. "Rusty's acting weird," Emma announced from the doorway, stating the obvious with her usual directness. "I noticed." Jake watched as the dog completed another circuit, his behavior growing more agitated with each pass. "Maybe he smells mice in the walls." But this wasn't the alert interest Rusty showed when tracking small animals. This was something else entirely, a focused intensity that reminded Jake of the way Sarah used to act when she was working through a particularly challenging research problem. Rusty stopped directly in front of the bookshelf and began to paw at the floor. Not the random scratching of a dog trying to dig, but deliberate, purposeful movements focused on one specific spot where the hardwood met the wall. "Stop that," Jake said automatically, moving to pull Rusty away. "You'll damage the floor." But as he knelt beside the dog, Jake noticed something odd. The section of flooring where Rusty was pawing looked different from the surrounding boards. Subtly different, the grain ran in a slightly different direction, and the wood appeared marginally newer than the rest. Jake ran his fingers along the floorboard, feeling for irregularities. There, a small gap where the board didn't quite align with its neighbors. And there, barely visible unless you knew to look for it, tiny holes that might once have held screws. "Emma, can you get me that screwdriver from the kitchen drawer?" Jake asked, his pulse quickening with the familiar thrill of discovery he'd once felt when uncovering elegant solutions to architectural challenges. "The little one or the big one?" "The little one." While Emma retrieved the tool, Jake examined the suspicious floorboard more carefully. Rusty sat beside him, panting with satisfaction, as if he'd been waiting years for someone to notice what he'd found. The screwdriver slipped easily into one of the tiny holes, and with gentle pressure, Jake felt something give, a hidden mechanism, simple but effective, that allowed the board to lift free with surprising ease. "Whoa," Emma breathed, peering over his shoulder. Beneath the loose floorboard was a cavity about 18 inches long, 12 inches wide, and perhaps 6 inches deep. Inside, wrapped in oiled cloth that had protected them from moisture and time, were 3 items that would change everything. The first was a leather-bound journal, its cover worn smooth by handling but still intact. The second was a brass key, ornate and old-fashioned, attached to a chain that caught the light like antique gold. The third was a roll of papers tied with string blueprints, from their size and the way they were stored. Jake lifted the journal first, surprised by its weight. The leather was soft with age, and the pages fell open naturally to reveal handwriting in black ink, careful, precise letters that spoke of education and deliberation. "Project Sanctuary," he read aloud from the first page. "Phase 1, Preparation." "What's Project Sanctuary?" Emma asked, settling cross-legged beside Jake as Rusty curled up nearby, apparently satisfied that his duty was complete. "I don't know yet." Jake turned the page, revealing more of the same careful handwriting. "But I think your great-grandfather left us some kind of message." The entries were dated, starting from 32 years ago and continuing sporadically through the decades. The early entries read like the notes of someone planning a complex project, references to securing the foundation, establishing protocols, and ensuring continuity. But as Jake read further, the tone shifted from methodical planning to something more urgent. They're watching again. Read one entry from 15 years ago. Margaret was right, we can never be too careful. The fail-safes must hold. Who's Margaret? Emma asked, reading over his shoulder with the ease of a child who'd learned to read early and well. I don't know that either. Jake set the journal aside and picked up the brass key. It was heavier than modern keys, with an intricate design that suggested it opened something important. But I think we're about to find out. The blueprints, when unrolled, revealed detailed architectural drawings of the house, but not the house as they'd seen it. These plans showed hidden rooms, secret passages, and modifications that transformed the Victorian mansion into something far more complex than it appeared. Look, Emma said, pointing to a section of the drawing. There's supposed to be a room behind the library wall, a big one. She was right. According to the blueprints, the space behind the bookshelf was not just empty wall, but a substantial room, accessible through a concealed entrance. Jake compared the drawings to his mental map of the house's layout, calculating dimensions and trying to reconcile what he'd observed with what Theodore had apparently built. This doesn't make sense, Jake said, though even as he spoke, pieces were beginning to connect. The house we walked through yesterday, it's missing about 300 square feet on this floor alone. Where did it go? It didn't go anywhere. It's hidden. Jake stood up, studying the bookshelf with new eyes. If Theodore had created secret rooms, there had to be a way to access them. The key might be part of it, but first they needed to find the entrance. Rusty, apparently deciding that his work was done, padded over to his favorite spot on the Persian rug and settled down for a nap. But his eyes remained alert, watching Jake and Emma with the satisfied expression of a dog who'd delivered an important message. Jake began examining the bookshelf systematically, looking for anything that might serve as a trigger or lever. The volumes themselves appeared to be a genuine collection of philosophy, literature, science, engineering texts that spoke of Theodore's wide-ranging interests. But one section, about shoulder-high on the far right, seemed different. The books there were newer, their spines less faded, and when Jake tried to remove one, a volume on advanced mathematics, it wouldn't budge. It was fixed in place, part of some larger mechanism. Emma, step back a little, Jake said, grasping the fake book and pulling firmly. The entire section of bookshelf swung inward with a soft click, revealing darkness beyond. They had found Theodore's secret. The hidden room beyond the bookshelf breathed with the mustiness of secrets kept too long. But underneath that was something else. The lingering scent of machine oil and paper, as if the space had been used regularly until quite recently. Jake fumbled along the wall until he found a light switch, and fluorescent fixtures flickered to life, revealing Theodore's private world. It was a study that belonged to a different era, or perhaps a different kind of man entirely. The walls were lined with filing cabinets, their metal surfaces bearing labels written in the same precise handwriting they'd found in the journal. Patents 1,991,995. Correspondence legal. Project files classified. A massive desk dominated the center of the room, its surface covered with papers, blueprints, and what appeared to be prototype devices that Jake couldn't immediately identify. It's like a secret laboratory, Emma whispered, her voice filled with the wonder that only children bring to genuine mysteries. Jake was thinking something similar, but his architectural eye caught details that spoke of serious purpose rather than fantasy. The room had its own ventilation system, separate from the main house. The electrical work was recent and professional. A small safe sat in one corner, its door standing open to reveal empty shelves that suggested recent removal of contents. But it was the photographs covering one entire wall that stopped Jake in his tracks. They showed a younger version of the man Jake assumed was Theodore, tall, distinguished, with the kind of confident bearing that came from intellectual achievement. But these weren't family portraits or casual snapshots. They were professional photographs showing Theodore at patent offices, shaking hands with men in expensive suits, standing beside complex machinery that Jake recognized as early computer equipment. Theodore Mercer receives Innovation Award. Read the caption under one newspaper clipping. Local inventor's breakthrough could revolutionize communications. He was famous, Emma said, studying a photograph that showed Theodore addressing what appeared to be a conference room full of attentive listeners. He was something, Jake agreed, moving to the desk where Theodore's personal journal lay open to a page dated just 3 years earlier. The handwriting was shakier than in the earlier entries, but the mind behind it remained sharp. Jake will be 28 next month. Sarah tells me in her letters that he's doing well with the architectural firm, that he's found his path. She doesn't know I've been corresponding with her, of course. Jake still believes I'm the absent grandfather who never cared enough to visit. Perhaps it's better that way. The work has required sacrifices that a young man shouldn't have to understand. But time grows short, and the enemy remains patient. If something happens to me before the project is complete, Jake will need to understand what we've been protecting. The evidence is secure, but someone must carry on the work, someone who understands the importance of building things that last. Jake read the passage twice, his hands trembling slightly. He knew Sarah. He was writing to her. "Why didn't she tell you?" Emma asked, with the directness that always cut through adult complications. "I don't know." But even as Jake said it, pieces of a larger puzzle were beginning to form. Sarah's cancer research had been funded by grants from organizations Jake had never heard of. She'd often worked late, claiming the research required absolute precision. And in her final weeks, she'd spoken about making sure the work continues, with an urgency that had seemed like delirium at the time. Jake opened the filing cabinet labeled Correspondence Personal and found what he was looking for, a folder thick with letters, all addressed to Sarah Mercer at her research laboratory. The most recent was dated just 6 months before her death. "My dear Sarah," it began, "your latest results confirm what we suspected about the cellular modification protocols. The applications extend far beyond cancer treatment, which is precisely why we must be careful about publication. There are those who would use this research for purposes we never intended." Jake's vision blurred as he read further. The letters revealed a collaboration that had lasted for years, Theodore providing funding and guidance for Sarah's research while she pursued applications that went far beyond what she'd ever discussed at home. But there was something else in the correspondence, a growing sense of urgency and danger. They know. Sarah had written in what appeared to be her final letter to Theodore. "Someone broke into the lab last week. Nothing was taken, but my research files were accessed. I'm moving the critical data to the secure server you provided. If anything happens to me, make sure Jake understands that the work must continue. He's stronger than he knows, and Emma will need the truth someday." The letter was dated 2 weeks before Sarah's diagnosis. Jake sank into Theodore's chair, the weight of revelation settling around him like a heavy coat. His wife hadn't just been a cancer researcher, she'd been part of something larger, something that Theodore had been protecting for decades. And her death, which Jake had accepted as a cruel twist of fate, might not have been as random as he'd believed. "Daddy?" Emma's voice seemed to come from very far away. "Are you okay?" Jake looked up to find his daughter watching him with concern that no 8-year-old should have to carry. She'd already lost her mother. She didn't need to see her father falling apart over revelations that might be too dangerous to pursue. "I'm fine, sweetheart. Just trying to understand what your great-grandfather was working on. Was it important?" Jake glanced around the hidden room, taking in the evidence of a life spent in careful preparation for threats he was only beginning to comprehend. "Yes, I think it was very important." He spent the next hour methodically examining Theodore's files, while Emma explored the room with the careful curiosity of a child who'd learned to be cautious around fragile things. The scope of Theodore's work became clearer with each document: patents for technologies that were decades ahead of their time, correspondence with government agencies, and research collaborations with universities around the world. But woven through it all was a pattern of paranoia that spoke of real danger. References to industrial espionage, warnings about compromised communications, and detailed security protocols that seemed excessive until Jake began to understand what Theodore had been protecting. The innovations weren't just valuable, they were revolutionary. Computer processing advances that could transform entire industries, communication technologies that could change how the world connected, and, most importantly, medical research applications that could save millions of lives. Or, in the wrong hands, research that could be weaponized in ways that made Jake's stomach turn. A loose photograph fell from one of the files as Jake was reading, landing face up on the desk. It showed Sarah and Theodore together, standing in what appeared to be a laboratory. Sarah looked younger, happier, filled with the excitement of discovery. Theodore's expression was harder to read, pride mixed with something that might have been worry. On the back, in Sarah's handwriting, "The work continues for Emma's future." Jake closed his eyes, trying to process the implications. His wife had been part of a secret research project. His grandfather, whom he'd thought was a stranger, had been watching over them for years. And now, apparently, the responsibility for continuing their work had fallen to him. The brass key still lay on the desk where he'd placed it, catching the fluorescent light like a promise or a threat. Whatever door it opened, Jake suspected it would lead to revelations that would change everything he thought he knew about his family's legacy. The original house blueprints lay spread across Theodore's desk like a treasure map, their edges weighted down with coffee mugs that bore the logos of technology companies Jake had never heard of. But as he studied the detailed drawings, comparing them to his mental map of the house they'd explored, Jake realized that Theodore had been far more than just a reclusive inventor. He'd been a master architect of secrets. "Look at this," Jake said, tracing a line on the blueprint with his finger. "According to these plans, there should be a workshop directly below us, accessible through the basement." Emma peered over his shoulder, her small finger following the same path. "And there's supposed to be another room behind the kitchen, a really big one." She was right. The blueprints showed the house as Theodore had envisioned it, not just a home, but a complex designed for concealment and security. Hidden passages connected the secret rooms, ventilation systems operated independently of the main house, and what appeared to be escape routes led to unmarked exits. Jake felt a chill of understanding. This wasn't paranoia, this was preparation for war. "Why would great-grandfather need so many hiding places?" Emma asked, voicing the question that was troubling Jake as well. Before he could answer, Rusty appeared in the doorway to the hidden room, his ears pricked forward in alert attention. The German shepherd padded to the far wall and began the same focused behavior he'd displayed over the loose floorboard nose, twitching, head tilted, intense concentration on something only he could detect. "Not again," Jake muttered, but he was beginning to trust the dog's instincts. This time, Rusty's attention was focused on what appeared to be a solid wall covered with filing cabinets. But when Jake consulted the blueprints, that wall should have been the entrance to Theodore's workshop. He began examining the filing cabinets more carefully, looking for the kind of hidden mechanism that had revealed the secret study. The solution, when he found it, was elegantly simple. One of the filing cabinets, the one labeled Project Files Archive, wasn't bolted to the wall like the others. When Jake grasped its sides and pulled gently, the entire unit rolled forward on hidden casters, revealing a narrow staircase that descended into darkness. "This house is like a puzzle box," Emma said with delight, apparently viewing their discoveries as an elaborate game rather than evidence of serious danger. Jake wished he could share her excitement, but the letters he'd read from Sarah were weighing heavily on his mind. Still, curiosity won over caution, and he found himself following the hidden staircase down into Theodore's most private space. The workshop below was a revelation. Unlike the study above, which felt like the domain of a scholar, this space belonged to a hands-on inventor. Workbenches lined the walls, equipped with tools that ranged from simple hand implements to sophisticated electronic equipment. Half-finished prototypes sat under dust covers, and the walls were covered with technical diagrams that hurt Jake's head to look at. But it was the photographs that truly told Theodore's story. They covered an entire wall in chronological order, creating a timeline of a brilliant man's descent into isolation. The early pictures showed Theodore at conferences, receiving awards, shaking hands with celebrities and politicians. He looked confident, successful, surrounded by admirers who clearly valued his contributions to their world. But as the photographs progressed through the decades, Theodore's expression changed. The confident smile became guarded, then worried, then frankly fearful. The people around him in the photographs changed to fewer colleagues and friends, more men in dark suits who looked like they'd stepped out of government agencies or corporate boardrooms. The final photographs in the sequence were the most telling. They showed Theodore alone in this very workshop, but he wasn't alone by choice. The pictures captured moments of apparent surveillance telephoto shots taken through windows, images of Theodore's car being followed, photographs of strangers watching his house from across the street. "Someone was hunting him," Jake said quietly, more to himself than to Emma. Hunting him for what? Jake was beginning to understand. The patents in Theodore's files weren't just valuable, they were dangerous. Computer technologies that could break government encryption, communication devices that could bypass official monitoring, and, most importantly, medical research that could be weaponized if it fell into the wrong hands. Theodore hadn't become a recluse because he was antisocial. He'd gone into hiding because he'd discovered something that made him a target. In a glass case near the far wall, Jake found what might have been Theodore's most important creation. It looked like a simple computer disk, but the label beneath it read, "Complete Research Archive Medical Applications Project." A handwritten note was taped beside it. "For Sarah's daughter, when she's old enough to understand." "He made this for me?" Emma asked, studying the disk with new interest. "It looks that way." Jake lifted the case carefully, surprised by its weight. Whatever was on this disk, Theodore had considered it important enough to preserve in a climate-controlled environment. A noise from upstairs, the sound of footsteps on the main floor, made them both freeze. Rusty's head came up, his ears rotating toward the source of the sound, and a low growl rumbled in his chest. "Someone's in the house," Jake whispered, his heart rate spiking with sudden fear. The footsteps were measured, deliberate, moving through the rooms with the confidence of someone who knew the layout. They paused in the library directly above the hidden workshop, and Jake heard the unmistakable sound of furniture being moved. "They're looking for something," Jake realized, his mind racing through possibilities. Had their discoveries somehow alerted someone to their presence? Were there people watching the house, waiting for them to find Theodore's secrets? "Daddy," Emma whispered, her earlier excitement replaced by fear. "What do we do?" Jake's eyes fell on the blueprints still spread on Theodore's desk. According to the plans, there was an escape tunnel that led from the workshop to an exit near the tree line behind the house. Theodore had built multiple ways out of every room, planning for exactly this kind of situation. "We follow your great-grandfather's plan," Jake said, gathering the most important documents and the research disk, "and we find out what he was really protecting." The footsteps above had moved into the kitchen, and Jake could hear drawers being opened, cabinets being searched. Whoever was up there wasn't being particularly careful about noise, which suggested either confidence or desperation. Rusty led them to the back corner of the workshop, where a section of paneling swung open at Jake's touch to reveal a narrow tunnel that stretched into darkness. The German shepherd entered without hesitation, apparently familiar with Theodore's escape routes. As they crawled through the tunnel that Theodore had built to protect his life's work, Jake realized that inheriting the house had been more than just good fortune. It had been a summons to continue a battle that had been raging for decades, a battle that had already cost Sarah her life, and might now cost them theirs. But for the first time since Sarah's death, Jake felt something stronger than grief. He felt purpose. The escape tunnel emerged behind a camouflaged grate near the edge of Theodore's property, hidden among overgrown rhododendron bushes that had clearly been cultivated for concealment rather than beauty. Jake helped Emma through the opening, then turned to watch the house they'd just fled. Through the library windows, he could see flashlight beams moving systematically from room to room. Professional searchers, he thought grimly, recognizing the methodical pattern from crime shows Sarah used to watch. These weren't random burglars looking for quick valuables, they were hunting for something specific. Rusty pressed against Jake's leg, his warm bulk providing comfort and stability in a situation that felt increasingly surreal. The German Shepherd's eyes remained fixed on the house, his ears rotating to track sounds that human hearing couldn't detect. "Are we going back?" Emma whispered, shivering in the cool evening air. "Not yet." Jake pulled out his phone, surprised to find several missed calls from a number he didn't recognize. The voicemail was from a woman who spoke with the crisp efficiency of someone accustomed to delivering important information quickly. "Mr. Mercer, this is attorney Patricia Vance calling about your grandfather's estate. It's urgent that we speak immediately. There are aspects of your inheritance that weren't covered in the initial documentation. Please call me back at any hour. This situation requires immediate attention." Jake stared at the phone, pieces of a larger puzzle clicking into place. The timing was too convenient, mysterious searches in the house, just hours after they'd discovered Theodore's secrets, followed by urgent calls from lawyers who'd somehow learned about their discovery. "Someone's been watching us," he realized aloud. The portfolio of patent documents he'd grabbed from Theodore's workshop weighed heavy in his jacket pocket. Jake pulled out the folder, using his phone's flashlight to examine the contents more carefully. What he found made his blood run cold. The patents weren't just valuable, they were worth hundreds of millions of dollars. Computer processing technologies that were now fundamental to modern smartphones. Communication protocols that formed the backbone of internet security. Medical research applications that had revolutionized cancer treatment. All of them filed under Theodore's name, all of them showing transfer dates to shell companies that Jake had never heard of. "He didn't just hide from people," Jake whispered, understanding flooding through him. "He hid his money from them too." The patent transfers told a story of elaborate financial engineering. Theodore had systematically moved his intellectual property through a maze of corporations, trusts, and offshore accounts. The breadcrumb trail led through dozens of entities, each one designed to obscure the true ownership of assets that were now worth more than most small countries' GDP. But at the end of the trail, all roads led back to a single beneficiary. Emma Catherine Mercer, Jake's daughter. "My God," Jake breathed, looking at Emma with new eyes. "You're an heiress." "What's an heiress?" Emma asked with the practical curiosity that always surfaced when adults started using words she didn't recognize. "It means your great-grandfather left you something very valuable." "More valuable than the house?" Jake looked at the patent documents again, running quick calculations in his head. The house was probably worth a few $100,000, maybe $500,000 if restored properly. But the intellectual property rights Theodore had accumulated and hidden. Conservative estimates put the value in the hundreds of millions, much more valuable than the house. A car door slammed in the distance, followed by voices speaking in low, urgent tones. Jake peered through the rhododendron bushes and saw two black SUVs parked in Theodore's driveway. Men in dark suits were emerging from the vehicles, moving with the coordinated efficiency of a team that had worked together before. "We need to go," Jake said, gathering the documents and taking Emma's hand. "Right now." They moved deeper into the woods behind Theodore's property, following what appeared to be a maintenance trail that wound between ancient pine trees. Rusty led the way with the confidence of a dog who'd walked this path before, occasionally stopping to ensure his human companions were keeping up. The trail eventually emerged at a small cabin that sat in a clearing about half a mile from the main house. The structure was simple but well maintained, with solar panels on the roof and what appeared to be its own water system. A small sign by the door read, T. Mercer, Caretaker Residence. Another safe house, Jake realized, using the brass key they'd found to unlock the front door. The cabin's interior was sparse but functional, a single room with a bed, kitchenette, and desk area. But it was clearly more than just emergency shelter. The desk was equipped with multiple computer monitors, communication equipment, and filing systems that suggested regular use. A note on the desk was addressed simply to "My successor" in Theodore's distinctive handwriting. If you're reading this, then the primary house has been compromised and you've had to use the emergency protocols. Good. That means you're learning to think like someone who's being hunted. The men searching the house work for a consortium of corporations and government agencies who have been trying to acquire my research for 30 years. They believe that intellectual property should serve state and corporate interests rather than human welfare. I have spent my life ensuring they remain disappointed. The patent portfolio you've found represents the visible portion of my work, valuable but ultimately replaceable. The real treasure is the research data that Sarah helped me develop. Medical applications that could eliminate most forms of cancer, neurological treatments that could end Alzheimer's, and genetic therapies that could extend human lifespan by decades. This research exists in only one place now, the secure data facility described in the attached coordinates. Sarah died protecting its location. I pray you will prove worthy of her sacrifice. Jake read the note twice, his hands shaking slightly. Sarah hadn't just died of cancer, she'd died protecting the cure for cancer. The irony was almost too cruel to process. But attached to the note was something that made everything else pale in comparison. A photograph of Emma as a newborn, held by a woman Jake had never seen before. On the back, in Sarah's handwriting, Project Inheritance Phase 2 begins with her. Daddy, Emma said quietly, who's that lady holding me? Jake studied the photograph more carefully. The woman was older, distinguished, with intelligent eyes that reminded him of someone. After a moment, he realized who she resembled. I think that might be Margaret, he said slowly, the woman your great-grandfather wrote about in his journal, but he said she was dead. Jake looked at the photograph again, noting details he'd missed before. The hospital room in the background was modern, equipped with technology that hadn't existed 30 years ago. The timestamp in the corner showed a date from just after Emma's birth. Maybe she's not as dead as people think. Outside, the sound of vehicles grew closer, and Rusty's ears pricked forward in alert attention. Through the cabin's windows, Jake could see flashlight beams moving through the trees, searching in their direction. They're coming, he said, gathering the documents and reaching for Emma's hand. We need to keep moving. But as they prepared to leave the safety of Theodore's cabin, Jake realized something had fundamentally changed. They weren't just running from mysterious searchers anymore, they were protecting something that could change the world. And somewhere out there, people who had killed Sarah and driven Theodore into hiding were getting closer to achieving their goal. The hunt was no longer just about them. It was about Emma's inheritance and the future that Sarah and Theodore had died to protect. The bundle of love letters Jake discovered in Theodore's desk drawer at the cabin changed everything he thought he understood about his grandfather's story. Wrapped in faded ribbon and preserved with the care of someone who treasured memories, the correspondence between Theodore and Margaret spanned nearly 4 decades and told a story of love, loss, and sacrifice that made Jake's chest tight with recognition. My dearest Theodore, the earliest letter began, dated 1985. Your presentation at the symposium was brilliant, as always, but I worry about the attention it's drawing. The applications you've described, the medical possibilities, they're exactly what the world needs. But we both know there are those who would use such breakthroughs for purposes we never intended. Margaret's handwriting was elegant, educated, the script of someone who'd grown up when penmanship mattered. But as Jake read through the chronological progression of their correspondence, he began to understand that Margaret wasn't just Theodore's romantic partner, she was his intellectual equal and professional collaborator. "The neural pathway research is proceeding faster than we anticipated," she wrote in a letter from 1991. "But we must be careful about publication. The military applications are too obvious, and I've heard rumors that certain government contractors are already experimenting with weaponized versions of our theoretical framework." Emma sat beside Jake on the cabin's small bed, holding Rusty and watching the flashlight beams move through the trees outside. The searchers were methodical but apparently unaware of the cabin's existence, giving them time to piece together the larger story. "She was a scientist too," Jake said, reading another letter that discussed research protocols and experimental data. "And she was worried about the same things Theodore was worried about." The middle section of the correspondence, covering the 1990s and early 2000s, revealed the growing threat that had eventually driven both Theodore and Margaret into hiding. References to industrial espionage, compromised laboratories, and colleagues who've disappeared painted a picture of scientific research that had become a battleground between those who wanted to help humanity and those who saw breakthrough technologies as weapons or profit opportunities. But it was Margaret's final letters, dated just 3 years before Sarah's death, that revealed the true scope of their situation. "The network is closing in," she wrote. "They've identified the research facilities and are systematically targeting anyone associated with the project. Dr. Harrison was killed in what they're calling a car accident, but we both know better. Dr. Chen's laboratory burned down under mysterious circumstances, and now they're asking questions about Sarah. We have to assume they know about the medical applications. The cancer treatment protocols, the genetic therapies, the neurological research, all of it could be perverted into biological weapons if it falls into the wrong hands. But more importantly, if they perfect the treatments first, they'll control who lives and who dies. That kind of power must never be concentrated in the hands of people who measure success by quarterly profits." Jake set the letter down, his hands trembling slightly. "They killed her too. Margaret, they killed both of them. But you said Margaret might still be alive," Emma pointed out with the logical precision that sometimes made her seem much older than 8. "I thought she might be. But these letters—" Jake trailed off as he noticed something odd about the final envelope in the bundle. Unlike the others, which bore Margaret's return address from various locations over the years, this one had no return address at all. And the postmark was recent, just 6 months ago. Inside was a single photograph and a brief note in handwriting that was similar to Margaret's but shakier. "Aged. Theodore is gone, but the work continues. Sarah's daughter must be protected at all costs. The coordinates he gave you will lead to answers, but be careful who you trust. They have people everywhere. M." The photograph showed the same woman from Emma's baby picture, but older now, standing in what appeared to be a modern laboratory. She was holding a vial of something that caught the light, like liquid gold, and her expression carried the satisfied weariness of someone who had finally achieved something important. "She is alive," Jake whispered, staring at the photograph. "And she's been watching us." Outside, the search teams had moved past the cabin, their voices fading into the distance. But Jake knew they'd be back. People who'd spent decades hunting Theodore's secrets wouldn't give up after one failed search. "We need to get to those coordinates," Jake said, checking Theodore's note again. The location was about 60 miles north, in the mountains near the Canadian border. "But first, we need to understand what we're walking into." He opened Theodore's laptop, which had been password protected until Jake tried Ematwo 1015, his daughter's name and birth year. The desktop revealed a complex network of encrypted files, secure communication programs, and what appeared to be real-time monitoring systems that tracked various research facilities around the world. One program, labeled Family Guardian, showed a map with moving dots that seemed to represent people or vehicles. Jake recognized their current location marked in green, but there were several red dots converging on the area the search teams that had found Theodore's house. "It's like a video game," Emma said, watching the dots move across the screen, "except scarier." Jake was examining the files when he found something that made his blood run cold. Surveillance reports on Emma's school, their old neighborhood, even their grocery store. Theodore hadn't just been watching over them from a distance, he'd been actively protecting them from threats they never knew existed. "Look at this," Jake said, opening a file labeled Threat Assessment Emma K. Mercer. It contained photographs of strangers who had apparently approached Emma's school, detailed background checks on her teachers, and security camera footage from locations they visited regularly. "Someone's been trying to get close to you," Jake told Emma gently. "Your great-grandfather was making sure they couldn't." The most disturbing entry was recent, a report from just 2 weeks ago, describing a failed approach at Emma's school. Someone had posed as a researcher studying gifted children, trying to get access to Emma specifically. Theodore's security network had intervened, and the person had disappeared. "Daddy," Emma said quietly, "I remember that. A lady came to my class and asked me questions about my family. Mrs. Rodriguez said it was for a special program, but then the lady never came back." Jake felt a chill of realization. The network hunting Theodore's research wasn't just interested in the patents and data they wanted Emma. As the ultimate beneficiary of Theodore's work and Sarah's research, she represented either the key to unlocking the remaining secrets or a hostage who could force cooperation. A soft chime from the laptop indicated an incoming message through one of Theodore's secure communication channels. The sender was identified only as M, and the message was brief but urgent. "They know about the cabin. Move to secondary location immediately. Trust the dog. He knows the way. The research must be protected, but Emma's safety comes first. Always remember, they want what she carries, not just what she inherits. M." "What do I carry?" Emma asked, reading over Jake's shoulder. Before Jake could answer, Rusty was at the door, whining with urgent insistence. The German shepherd's ears were pricked forward, and his body language suggested immediate danger approaching. Through the cabin's windows, Jake could see new lights moving through the trees, not the random searching of before, but the focused advance of people who knew exactly where they were going. "Time to go," Jake said, grabbing Theodore's laptop and the bundle of letters. "Rusty's going to show us the way." As they slipped out the cabin's back door and into the darkness of the forest, Jake realized that Emma's inheritance was more than just money and patents. Sarah and Theodore had been working on something that had made their daughter a target from the moment she was born. And somewhere in the mountains ahead, Margaret was waiting with answers that could either save them or destroy everything they'd ever loved. The safety deposit box sat in the vault of Millbrook Community Bank like a time capsule waiting to reveal its secrets. Jake's hands shook slightly as he inserted the brass key. Theodore had hidden beneath the floorboards, Emma beside him in the small, sterile room that smelled of metal and old paper. They'd spent the night in an abandoned hunting lodge that Rusty had led them to, following paths through the forest that seemed to exist in the German shepherd's memory rather than on any map. The dog had proven to be more than just a pet he was, Theodore's final guardian, programmed with escape routes and safe locations that had kept them ahead of their pursuers. "Are you ready?" Jake asked Emma, though he wasn't sure he was ready himself. The box opened with a soft click, revealing contents that would change everything Jake thought he knew about his family's story. On top was a death certificate, Theodore James Mercer, deceased 3 months ago from natural causes. But beneath it was something that made Jake's world tilt sideways. A driver's license issued just 2 months ago to Thomas J. Matthews, bearing Theodore's photograph. "He faked his own death," Jake whispered, staring at the documents with growing amazement and confusion. Emma peered into the box with the fearless curiosity that had carried her through so many recent discoveries. Why would great-grandfather pretend to be dead if he's not really dead? Jake was wondering the same thing as he examined the rest of the box's contents. There was a bank account statement showing deposits totaling over $50 million made in the weeks following Theodore's supposed death. Transfer receipts for properties purchased under various assumed names. And most shocking of all, a recent photograph showing Theodore very much alive, standing beside a woman Jake now recognized as Margaret. But it was the letter at the bottom of the box that explained everything. My dear grandson, if you're reading this, then you've proven yourself worthy of the truth. My death was carefully staged to protect you and Emma from those who have been hunting our family for decades. The funeral you didn't attend was elaborate theater, complete with a closed casket and mourners who believed they were saying goodbye to a broken old man. But death, as I've learned, can be a powerful ally when you're fighting enemies who believe they've already won. I am alive, Jake, and I am waiting for you. But more importantly, I've been preparing for the moment when you would join the fight that claimed your wife and has threatened your daughter since the day she was born. The inheritance was never just about money or property. It was about bringing you into a war that your family has been fighting for 3 generations. A war between those who believe human knowledge should serve humanity and those who see breakthrough science as a path to power and control. Sarah died because she refused to surrender research that could revolutionize medicine. Margaret has spent 30 years in hiding because she discovered that governments and corporations were planning to weaponize technologies meant to heal. And Emma has been a target since birth because she carries something that makes her the most valuable person on Earth. You see, Jake, the research wasn't just theoretical. We tested it on Emma. The genetic modifications we developed to cure cancer, to enhance neural function, to extend human lifespan. Emma has been the proof of concept since she was 6 months old. Every injection she received that you thought was a standard vaccination was actually an experimental treatment that has made her immune to most diseases and enhanced her cognitive abilities beyond normal human parameters. She's not just inheriting our fortune, Jake. She is our fortune, the living, breathing result of research that could transform the human species. This is why they want her. This is why they killed Sarah when she tried to withdraw from the project. And this is why you must bring Emma to me before they realize what she truly represents. The coordinates Margaret gave you will lead to our research facility. But be warned, the journey will be dangerous, and not everyone who claims to be helping you can be trusted. The network we're fighting has agents everywhere, including some who will approach you as allies. Trust only Rusty. Trust only each other, and trust the evidence of your own eyes. Emma's abilities will become more apparent as stress triggers her enhanced systems. She is stronger, smarter, and more resilient than any 8-year-old should be because we made her that way. She is the future of human evolution, and she is my granddaughter. Come quickly, time is running out. Your grandfather, Theodore, very much alive, Mercer. Jake read the letter 3 times, each reading making the implications more staggering and more terrifying. He looked at Emma, who was studying the photographs with the concentrated attention she brought to particularly interesting puzzles. Emma, he said carefully, do you remember being sick much when you were little? Not really, she said, still examining the pictures. Mom always said I had good genes. Why? Jake's mind raced through memories he'd never questioned before. Emma had never caught the colds that swept through her preschool. She'd never needed antibiotics for ear infections that plagued other children. She learned to read at 3, was doing complex math by 5, and had always seemed to understand concepts that challenged children twice her age. He'd attributed it to good genetics and Sarah's careful attention to nutrition and education. But now, Emma, when you're scared or upset, do you ever feel different, stronger, or more alert? Emma looked up from the photographs, her blue eyes meeting his with an intelligence that suddenly seemed far beyond her years. Sometimes, she said quietly. "Like when those men were in the house last night, I could hear things you couldn't hear, and I knew exactly which way we needed to go in the forest, even in the dark." Jake felt a chill of understanding. The genetic enhancements hadn't just protected Emma from disease, they'd given her abilities that would make her invaluable to anyone seeking to create enhanced human beings. She wasn't just Theodore's heir, she was his masterpiece. "Are you angry at me?" Emma asked, apparently reading something in Jake's expression that he hadn't realized he was showing. "No, sweetheart, I'm not angry at you. I'm angry at the people who put you in danger before you were even born. But I'm okay, right? I mean, I'm still me?" Jake pulled Emma into a hug that was fierce with protectiveness and love. "You're absolutely still you. You're just a little bit more than we realized. Like a superhero, something like that." Outside the bank, Jake's phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "They know about the safety deposit box. You have 15 minutes before they arrive. Follow Rusty to the vehicle we've prepared. M." Through the bank's windows, Jake could see black SUVs turning onto Main Street, moving with the purposeful speed of people who knew exactly where they were going. "Time to meet your great-grandfather," Jake said, gathering the documents and taking Emma's hand. As they left the bank through the rear exit that Rusty somehow knew about, Jake realized that everything he'd thought he understood about his life had been carefully constructed theater. Sarah's death, Theodore's absence, even their financial struggles, all of it had been part of a larger plan to protect Emma until she was old enough to understand her true nature. But now the performance was over, and the real story was about to begin. In the parking lot behind the bank, an unremarkable sedan waited with keys in the ignition and a GPS unit pre-programmed with coordinates that would lead them to Theodore. As they drove toward the mountains where answers waited, Jake couldn't shake the feeling that they were driving toward either salvation or the end of everything they'd ever known. Emma fell asleep in the passenger seat as they climbed into the mountains, her enhanced metabolism allowing her to recover from stress faster than any normal child. Rusty sat alert in the back seat, watching the road behind them with the vigilance of a guardian who understood that their most dangerous challenges still lay ahead. The research facility hidden in the Rocky Mountains looked like nothing more than an abandoned mining operation. From the outside, rusted equipment, weathered buildings, and warning signs that discouraged casual exploration. But as Jake followed the GPS coordinates deeper into the complex, following access roads that seemed to exist only for their vehicle, the true scope of Theodore's operation became clear. Underground levels extended deep into the mountain, protected by security systems that recognized their approach and guided them through checkpoints that would have been invisible to uninvited guests. Rusty led them through passages that the German shepherd navigated with the confidence of someone returning home after a long journey. "This place is huge," Emma said, her voice echoing slightly in the high-tech corridors that looked more like a space station than anything that belonged in rural Montana. Jake was thinking the same thing, but his architect's eye caught details that spoke of massive investment and careful planning. The facility had been built to last decades and to withstand almost any kind of assault. This wasn't just a research laboratory, it was a fortress designed to protect the future of human evolution. They found Theodore in what appeared to be the facility's main laboratory, standing beside equipment that Jake couldn't begin to identify. At 78, Theodore Mercer was taller than Jake had expected, with silver hair and intelligent eyes that carried the weight of decades spent fighting impossible battles. But what struck Jake most was how much Theodore looked like him, or rather, how much Jake looked like a younger version of the man who had shaped his life from the shadows. "Hello, Jake," Theodore said, his voice carrying warmth that contradicted years of absence. "Thank you for protecting her." Before Jake could respond, Emma had crossed the laboratory and was studying Theodore with the direct gaze that she brought to all new experiences. "You're really not dead," she said, as if confirming a scientific hypothesis. "I'm really not dead," Theodore agreed solemnly, "though there were times when being dead would have been considerably safer." A woman emerged from another section of the laboratory, Margaret. Older now than in the photographs, but still carrying herself with the dignity of someone who had never surrendered to circumstances beyond her control. Her eyes, when they met Jake's, carried sympathy that spoke of shared loss and understanding. "I'm sorry about Sarah," Margaret said simply. "She was brilliant, and she was brave, and she died because she refused to let them turn her work into a weapon. Tell me what really happened," Jake said, the words coming out harsher than he'd intended. "Tell me why my wife had to die, and why my daughter has been turned into some kind of experiment." Theodore and Margaret exchanged glances that spoke of conversations they'd had many times over the years. It was Margaret who answered, her voice carrying the careful precision of someone who had spent decades explaining complex truths to people who weren't ready to hear them. "The research began innocently enough," she said, leading them to a conference room where walls were covered with charts, graphs, and photographs that documented decades of scientific advancement. "Theodore and I were working on cellular regeneration, trying to understand how the human body could be enhanced to resist disease and aging. We made breakthroughs that would have been Nobel Prize material," Theodore added, settling into a chair that suggested he'd spent countless hours in this room. "Cancer treatments that could eliminate tumors without chemotherapy. Genetic modifications that could prevent Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, even simple aging. We thought we were going to save the world. But other people saw military applications," Margaret continued. "Enhanced soldiers who could fight longer, heal faster, resist biological weapons. Intelligence agencies saw interrogation applications, ways to enhance memory or resist psychological pressure. Corporations saw products that could be sold to the highest bidder." Emma had been listening with the focused attention she brought to complex explanations, and now she raised her hand as if she were in school. "So you tested the good stuff on me to make sure the bad people couldn't get it?" "That's exactly right," Theodore said, his expression softening as he looked at his great-granddaughter. "We needed to prove that the enhancements could work safely in a human subject. And we needed to create someone who could carry the research forward if something happened to us." Jake felt a surge of anger that surprised him with its intensity. "You had no right to experiment on her without my consent, without Sarah's consent." "Sarah gave her consent," Margaret said quietly. "She volunteered Emma for the program after she realized what we were fighting against. She'd seen the classified reports about what happens when enhancement technology falls into the wrong hands." Margaret activated a wall screen that showed photographs Jake wished he'd never seen, images from classified government facilities where enhancement research had been weaponized. Soldiers whose genetic modifications had driven them insane. Test subjects who had died in agony as their bodies rejected experimental treatments. Corporate executives who had used cognitive enhancements to manipulate global markets. "This is what they wanted to do with our research," Theodore said grimly, "and they were willing to kill anyone who stood in their way." "Including Sarah," Jake said, the pieces finally falling into place. "Sarah tried to withdraw from the project when she realized how dangerous it was becoming," Margaret explained. "She wanted to take Emma and disappear, start over somewhere they'd never be found. But by then, Emma had already received the full series of treatments. She was evidence of what the research could accomplish. So they killed her to get to Emma." "They tried," Theodore said, "but Sarah was smarter than they gave her credit for. She made it look like Emma's enhancements had failed, falsified medical records, staged test results that suggested the treatments hadn't worked. As far as the network knew, Emma was just a normal child who might carry some genetic potential but wasn't worth immediate pursuit." "Until now," Jake realized. "Until now," Margaret confirmed. "Your financial troubles, the inheritance, even the discovery of the hidden rooms, all of it was designed to activate Emma's dormant systems and bring her enhanced abilities to the surface. We needed her to be old enough to understand what was happening, and we needed you to be ready to protect her." Jake looked at Emma, who was studying the wall displays with the absorbed concentration she brought to particularly complex puzzles. Even now, faced with revelations that would traumatize most adults, she seemed to be processing information with remarkable calm and clarity. "How enhanced is she?" Jake asked. "See for yourself," Theodore said, activating another screen that showed real-time biological readings. "Emma, would you mind if we ran a few simple tests?" For the next hour, Jake watched his daughter demonstrate abilities that redefined his understanding of human potential. She solved mathematical problems that would challenge graduate students. She identified patterns in complex data that had taken researchers months to discover. Most remarkably, she displayed physical capabilities that were clearly beyond normal human parameters, lifting weights that should have been impossible for her size, reacting to stimuli faster than Jake could track. "The enhancements aren't just medical," Margaret explained as they watched Emma effortlessly balance on a beam that challenged Jake's own coordination. "They're comprehensive improvements to human cognitive and physical function. Emma represents what the next stage of human evolution could look like. And that's why they want her," Jake said, understanding flooding through him. "She's not just proof that the technology works, she's a template they could use to create others. Or to study how the enhancements function so they can develop weapons to counter them," Theodore added grimly. "Emma isn't just valuable as a subject, she's valuable as a key to understanding how enhanced humans can be controlled or eliminated." A soft alarm began sounding throughout the facility, and Jake saw Theodore and Margaret exchange glances that spoke of rehearsed emergency protocols. "They've found us," Margaret said, checking readings on a security monitor. 3 vehicles approaching from the main access road, 2 more coming from the service entrance. "They're not even trying to be subtle anymore." "How long do we have?" Theodore asked, moving to a control panel that Jake assumed managed the facility's defensive systems. 20 minutes, maybe 30, if the outer barriers slow them down." Jake felt the familiar surge of protective instincts that had carried him through every crisis since Sarah's death. But this time was different. This time, he had allies who understood what they were fighting for. "What's the plan?" he asked. Theodore and Margaret looked at each other, then at Emma, who was watching the conversation with the alert attention of someone who understood that important decisions were being made. "There's only one way to end this permanently," Theodore said finally. "We have to give them what they want." "You want to surrender, Emma?" Jake asked, incredulous. "No," Margaret said, her voice carrying the quiet conviction of someone who had spent 30 years planning for this moment. "We want to make them think we're surrendering, Emma, and then we're going to destroy everything they've worked decades to acquire." As alarms continued to sound and security monitors showed vehicles full of armed men approaching their mountain sanctuary, Jake realized that the final confrontation wasn't just about protecting Emma anymore. It was about determining the future of human evolution itself. The encrypted communication device Theodore pressed into Jake's hands looked like nothing more than a modified smartphone, but the weight of it suggested technology far more sophisticated than anything commercially available. The screen showed a real-time tactical display of the mountain facility, with red dots converging on their position from multiple directions. "This connects you to our entire network," Theodore explained rapidly, as Margaret prepared what appeared to be a sophisticated recording system. "Every safe house, every ally, every piece of evidence we've gathered over 30 years. If something happens to us, you'll have everything you need to continue the fight." Outside, the sound of vehicles drawing closer mixed with the mechanical whir of defensive systems activating throughout the facility. Jake could see Emma processing the situation with the enhanced cognitive abilities that made her seem much older than her 8 years, her blue eyes tracking movements and calculating possibilities with disturbing precision. "They're not just here for Emma," Margaret said, studying surveillance feeds that showed armed teams positioning themselves around the facility's entrances. "Look at the equipment they're carrying. This is a full extraction operation. They plan to take everything." Jake examined the tactical display more carefully, noting details that his architectural training helped him interpret. The attackers weren't just surrounding the facility, they were mapping it, using equipment that suggested they had detailed knowledge of the underground complex's layout. Someone gave them our blueprints, he realized, which means we have a traitor in our network, Theodore said grimly. Someone who's been feeding them information while we thought we were staying ahead of them. The implication hit Jake like a physical blow. If their network had been compromised, then every safe house, every ally, every carefully planned escape route might be a trap waiting to spring. Daddy, Emma said quietly, her enhanced hearing apparently picking up sounds that Jake couldn't detect. There are people in the tunnels. They're not using the main entrances. Theodore's expression shifted from concern to alarm as he checked additional security feeds. Emma was right. Tactical teams were moving through service tunnels that shouldn't have been accessible to outsiders, advancing with the confidence of people who knew exactly where they were going. They've been planning this for months, Margaret said, her voice carrying the weight of someone who'd spent decades fighting an enemy that always seemed one step ahead. Every move we've made, every precaution we've taken, they've been anticipating it all. Jake felt the familiar surge of protective determination that had carried him through every crisis since Sarah's death. But now it was mixed with something else, tactical thinking that he'd never known he possessed. Whether it was the stress of the situation or some inherited instinct, he found himself analyzing the facility's defensive positions with the eye of someone who understood both architecture and warfare. The main laboratory has 3 exits, he said, studying the facility's layout on the communication device. But they're covering all of them. Unless what? Theodore asked. Jake pointed to a section of the facility's blueprints that showed an anomaly he'd noticed earlier. This ventilation system, it's oversized for a facility this size, and it connects to the old mining tunnels that run through the entire mountain. Those tunnels were sealed decades ago, Margaret protested. From the inside, Jake said, pieces of a larger plan falling into place. But if someone knew the facility's original construction... Theodore's eyes widened with understanding. Sarah. She helped design the facility's integration with the existing mining infrastructure. She would have known about alternate routes that weren't included in the official blueprints. Emma had been listening to their conversation with the focused attention she brought to complex problems, and now she spoke with a certainty that surprised them all. Mom left us a way out, she said simply. I can feel it. Before anyone could ask what she meant, alarms throughout the facility began blaring with increased urgency. On the surveillance monitors, Jake could see armed figures in tactical gear moving through corridors that were supposed to be secure, advancing with the coordination of a military operation. They're inside, Margaret said, activating what appeared to be emergency protocols throughout the facility. All non-essential systems are shutting down. We have maybe 10 minutes before they reach the main laboratory. Theodore moved to a wall safe that Jake hadn't noticed before, removing items that included weapons, additional communication devices, and what appeared to be data storage units containing decades of research. Jake, I need you to understand something, Theodore said, pressing a pistol into Jake's hands despite his protests. These people killed Sarah because she wouldn't give them what they wanted. They'll kill Emma without hesitation if they think she's more valuable dead than alive. What are you saying? I'm saying that sometimes protecting someone means being willing to fight for them, really fight. The sound of approaching footsteps echoed through the corridor outside the laboratory, and Rusty positioned himself between the entrance and Emma with the alert intensity of a guardian who understood that the final confrontation was about to begin. Jake looked at the weapon in his hands, then at Emma, who was watching him with trust that made his chest tight with determination. For the first time since Sarah's death, Jake Mercer wasn't just trying to survive. He was ready to fight. The final confession recording began when the laboratory doors burst open and armed figures in tactical gear swept into the room with the coordinated precision of people who'd done this many times before. But Jake was ready for them. The recording device Theodore had given him activated and hidden, capturing everything that was about to unfold. "Dr. Theodore Mercer," said the man who was clearly the team leader, removing his helmet to reveal a face that belonged in corporate boardrooms rather than military operations. "My name is Director Harrison Wells. Yes, the same Harrison Wells who's been your lawyer for the past 3 years. I must say, your death was very convincing." Jake felt a chill of betrayal as he recognized the voice from the phone calls about Theodore's estate. The lawyer who'd guided them through the inheritance process had been working for the enemy all along. "Hello, Harrison," Theodore said calmly, as if he'd been expecting this moment for years. "I assume you're here to discuss terms." "Terms?" Wells laughed, signaling his team to secure the laboratory's exits. "Theodore, you've led us on a chase that's lasted 30 years and cost my organization millions of dollars. The time for negotiation ended when you faked your death and disappeared with research that belongs to the American people." "Research that belongs to humanity," Margaret corrected, stepping forward with the dignity of someone who'd spent decades defending principles that mattered more than profit or power. "Dr. Margaret Chen," Wells said, his voice carrying mock surprise. "Alive after all these years, your death was much less convincing than Theodore's. We've been tracking you for months." Jake kept the recording device pointed toward Wells while positioning himself between the armed team and Emma, who was watching the confrontation with the alert calm that her enhancements apparently provided in high-stress situations. "What do you want?" Jake asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. Wells turned his attention to Jake with the predatory focus of someone who'd been studying his target for a long time. "Mr. Jake Mercer, successful architect, devoted father, and now the unwilling inheritor of the most valuable research project in human history. What I want is simple, complete cooperation and access to everything your grandfather has hidden. And if we refuse..." Wells smiled with the cold efficiency of someone who'd had this conversation before. "Then we take what we need and eliminate the complications. Your daughter represents 30 years of research that my organization has invested billions of dollars developing. She's coming with us, regardless of your cooperation." "Over my dead body," Jake said, surprised by the conviction in his own voice. "That can be arranged," Wells replied casually, "but it would be much easier if you simply acknowledge the reality of your situation. Emma isn't just your daughter anymore, she's a prototype for the future of human enhancement, and that future belongs to people who have the vision and resources to manage it properly." Theodore stepped forward, his voice carrying the authority of someone who'd been fighting this battle longer than anyone else in the room. "You want to know what we've learned in 30 years of research, Harrison? What we've discovered about the enhancement process? I'm listening." "We've learned that enhancement without wisdom is just another form of corruption, that power without conscience creates monsters, and that people like you will always choose control over compassion." Wells signaled to his team, and Jake saw weapons being raised toward Emma. But before anyone could act, Emma herself stepped forward with the fearless directness that had carried her through every challenge of the past few days. "You can't make more people like me," she said, her young voice carrying certainty that silenced the entire room. "The treatments only work on children, and only if they're given exactly right. If you try to copy what they did to me, the people you experiment on will die." Wells stared at Emma with new interest. "How do you know that?" "Because I can feel it," Emma said simply. "The enhancements aren't just medicine, they're alive. They're part of me now, and they protect themselves. If you try to take them out of me to study them, they'll stop working." Jake watched Wells's expression shift from confidence to uncertainty as Emma continued speaking with knowledge that no 8-year-old should possess. "But more than that," Emma said, "I know who you really are. You're not with the government. You're with Meridian Corporation, and you've been stealing research from real scientists for 20 years. My mum found out about you, and that's why you killed her." Wells's face went pale, and Jake knew that Emma had just provided them with the confession they needed. The recording device was capturing everything: the admission of corporate identity, the reference to Sarah's murder, and most importantly, Wells's failure to deny any of it. "You're going to let us go," Jake said, holding up the recording device so Wells could see it. "Because if you don't, this recording goes to every news outlet, government agency, and research institution in the world. Your organization will be exposed, and everyone you've hurt will finally get justice." Wells stared at the device, calculating possibilities and realizing that his perfectly planned operation had just become a liability that could destroy everything his organization had worked to build. The final confrontation had begun, and for the first time, Jake's family held the advantage. 6 months later, Jake stood in the restored library of Thornfield Manor, watching Emma practice piano on the baby grand that Theodore had insisted on buying for her 8th birthday celebration. The morning sun streamed through windows that had been professionally cleaned and repaired, casting golden light across hardwood floors that gleamed with the polish of careful restoration. The house had been transformed from a neglected relic into the warm family home it was always meant to be. But more than the physical restoration, it was the sense of peace that made the difference, the knowledge that they were finally safe, finally free to build the life that Sarah would have wanted for them. The restored family portrait hanging above the fireplace showed 4 generations of Mercers: Theodore's parents, whom Jake had never known, Theodore himself as a young inventor, Sarah, radiant with the joy of new motherhood, Jake holding infant Emma, and at the center, Emma, as she was now confident, intelligent, and surrounded by the love that had protected her through the most dangerous months of her young life. "Play the one Mom taught you," Jake said, settling into the comfortable armchair that had become his favorite spot for morning coffee and evening reflection. Emma's fingers found the keys of a melody that Sarah had hummed during late-night feedings and quiet moments of early motherhood. The song filled the library with warmth that seemed to bring Sarah's presence back into their lives, not as grief, but as gratitude for the love that continued to guide them. Theodore emerged from his study, the former secret room that was now simply his office, carrying architectural plans that had occupied much of his attention since Meridian Corporation's spectacular downfall. At 78, he moved with the energy of someone who'd finally found purpose that didn't require hiding or fighting. "The Cancer Research Center is ahead of schedule," he announced, spreading the blueprints across the library table. "The Sarah Mercer Memorial Institute will be operational by next spring." Jake examined the plans with professional interest and personal pride. The research facility would be built on land purchased with a fraction of the $200 million trust that Theodore had accumulated over decades of careful investment. But unlike the mountain fortress they'd escaped from, this facility would be open, transparent, dedicated to healing rather than enhancement. "Mom would have loved this," Emma said, finishing the melody and joining them at the table. Her enhanced abilities were more apparent. Now she could read the architectural drawings as easily as Jake could, understanding structural relationships and design principles that should have been beyond her years. But rather than making her seem alien, the enhancements had simply made her more herself: curious, compassionate, and determined to use her gifts to help others. "She did love it," Theodore said gently. "The design was her idea. She spent months planning a research facility that could never be weaponized because everything would be published openly, shared freely with anyone who wanted to continue the work." Margaret appeared in the doorway, carrying the morning mail and wearing the satisfied expression of someone who just received particularly good news. At 75, she'd embraced her role as Emma's unofficial grandmother with the enthusiasm of someone making up for lost time. "The last of Meridian's research facilities has been shut down," she announced, waving a government document that bore impressive official seals. Harrison Wells received a life sentence for corporate espionage and murder. The judge said it was one of the most comprehensive cases of scientific theft he'd ever seen. Jake felt a surge of satisfaction that had nothing to do with revenge and everything to do with justice. The recording Emma had helped them make had proven to be the key that unlocked decades of corporate crime. Wells's confession had led to investigations that exposed a network of stolen research, murdered scientists, and suppressed technologies that should have been helping humanity. "What about the other enhanced children?" Emma asked, displaying the concern for others that made Jake proud of the person she was becoming. "All found and safe," Margaret assured her. 17 children over the past 20 years, all recovered and reunited with families who thought they'd lost them. "The deprogramming is going well. Most of them will be able to live normal lives." "But I don't want a normal life," Emma said with the directness that always cut through adult complications. "I want to use what I can do to help people." Jake reached over to squeeze his daughter's hand, marveling at the strength and wisdom that genetic enhancement had given her, but even more at the compassion that came from her own generous heart. "You will," he promised. "But first, you get to be a kid. You get to go to school, make friends, learn things just because they're interesting. The world will still need help when you're older." Emma nodded solemnly, understanding the wisdom in patience, even as her enhanced mind raced with possibilities for the future. Rusty padded into the library from his favorite sunny spot on the back porch, moving with the dignified pace of a dog who'd earned his retirement. At 11, the German Shepherd had become the beloved patriarch of their restored family, content to guard their happiness rather than their secrets. "Any regrets?" Theodore asked Jake as they watched Emma return to the piano, filling the house with music that spoke of joy rather than sorrow. Jake considered the question carefully. 6 months ago, he'd been a broken man sleeping on floors, struggling to provide basic shelter for his daughter. Now he was an architect again, designing homes for families who needed fresh starts, funded by Theodore's trust and guided by lessons learned about what really mattered in life. "Just one," Jake said finally. "I wish Sarah could see this, could see Emma growing up safe and loved, could see you back in our lives where you belong." "She can see it," Theodore said with the quiet conviction of someone who'd spent decades thinking about legacy and love. "Every time Emma plays her music, every time you design a home that shelters a family, every time we choose healing over harm, Sarah's vision lives on." As if summoned by their conversation, Emma began playing a new melody, something bright and hopeful that she was composing herself. The notes danced through the restored library, through the house that had hidden so many secrets, through the lives that had been broken and were now being rebuilt with intention and love. Outside, the town of Millbrook was waking up to another peaceful morning. The Sarah Mercer Memorial Institute was taking shape on the hillside, promising advances in medical research that would benefit everyone rather than the privileged few. And in the restored Victorian mansion that had once sheltered secrets, a family was finally free to build the future that love had always intended. Jake closed his eyes and listened to his daughter's music, feeling Sarah's presence in every note, and knowing that sometimes the most beautiful things grow from the most broken places.